All right. Well, hopefully you played along and you thought about five applicants. Who would you hire? I don't know the right answer to what job you might have been thinking about or what might have motivated you to pick what you picked. But I thought I would share with you what data we have on the different traits in the workplace. So we've got conscientiousness, and people who are higher in that tend to be more careful, more thorough, dependable, and accurate. And so let's say that you were hiring for somebody in appliance sales. Well, what they have found in the research is that people who are in appliance sales set higher goals and were committed to reaching them when they were higher in conscientiousness. They expended greater effort and were more persistent in their behaviors in striving towards that goal. So conscientiousness might be a good characteristic for maybe somebody who's in a sales position or something like that, where goal setting is part of it, persistence is part of it, things like that. It's the only thing I can say about the Big Five inventory and any kind of research. So anything you said is correct if you thought about that problem that I gave you. All right, let's move on to another kind of test, which is integrity tests. So integrity tests are designed to predict whether an employee will engage in counterproductive or dishonest work-related behaviors. And this can range from cheating to stealing from the organization to actually sabotaging the organization. So, I mean, it can be a very small thing that's counterproductive all the way up to a really big thing. Overt integrity tests tend to measure attitudes toward theft, and they tend to ask about actual theft behaviors. So this is a self-report. So they ask about, would this be right or wrong? What would you think about a person who did this? And then they also might ask things like, have you ever done this or that? The personality type of integrity test is one that asks about personality characteristics that research has suggested go along with being the sort of person who would engage in counterproductive behavior. It doesn't matter which one you administer, honestly, as far as its ability to predict. Both of them do about 22%. They can account for about 22% of the variability between people on counterproductive behaviors. And they predict about 12% of the variability between people on job performance. So they actually might be worthwhile to administer as part of a battery, because you get a little insight into whether they're likely to be counterproductive, but you also get a little insight into whether they are going to be good at the job as well. How about work samples? So I have a little video here, and I'll put it in the playlist so you can watch it when I get done talking in this section. But work samples are an opportunity for a candidate to exhibit their skills, their ways of working, thinking, and their attitudes about work. So work samples, like I said with the waitress example, where they are showing how they would carry 3 plates. Or like I said with the professor example, they come and give a 50-minute talk that would be like one of their lectures in a class. So work samples are an opportunity for the employer to see that person actually doing the work that they're applying for. So to define it in another way, I wrote that work samples duplicate performance criteria measures and use them as predictors. So you're going to actually be having some kind of work performance. So to get specific about some work samples that exist, there are situational judgment tests, which are paper and pencil tests. A lot of times they might be video scenarios where you watch something and then you say what you would do. And what they are looking for is how you make judgments in the workplace. Like, how would you solve that problem? I don't want to say there are no right answers. There are probably multiple ways that you could answer correctly. There are probably a few ways that you could absolutely answer incorrectly. You might give solutions that the organization is like just opposed to, that they wouldn't want to see. Subject matter experts are always going to score these situational judgment tests. And these kinds of tests can account for about 25% of the variance between people in job performance. So again, you would think maybe these would be better because they're showing us the real, like how they would act in a situation, but you can't, just to manage expectations, right? We can't get the full spectrum of all the things that might happen in the workplace that would really impact a person's performance in a job sample, right? Like a work sample, maybe you could give a great 50-minute lecture on one topic that is very specific that you're passionate about. But then when we put you in the classroom teaching an introductory level class that has like this breadth of knowledge and stuff, you're terrible. You're like boring, can't think of any examples, just an awful performance in real life. But if I give you 50 minutes to talk about the thing that you're the most passionate about, yeah, you were awesome. Wow, great performance. So these situational judgment tests are kind of like that. We give you a little snippet of something that you might encounter in the workplace, and you provide your answers. And yeah, there's still like a lot of things that happen in the work, maybe 75% of the rest of the job that isn't really accounted for by this example. So that's the limitation on that. All right, what if we get a little bit bigger? What if we try and include more things in one process? This would be called an assessment center. This is where multiple raters are going to evaluate applicants, or you can also use assessment centers for like people who are already in the job who maybe are looking for getting promoted in the future on a standardized set of predictors that simulate the job. So here is my decorative predictors. You don't have to have all of these at the assessment center, but these are the kinds of things that you can include. And some of them look familiar because we've already talked about them here, but you can have group exercises. You could have in-basket exercises. We haven't talked about that yet. Psychometric tests. You could put people into social situations and evaluate how they respond in those social situations. You can ask them to give presentations. You can hold interviews. Like there's all these different things that you can do at the assessment center. You mostly are going to have like some subset. There's 6 things I've got listed here. Typical assessment center might have 3 or 4 things you're doing. Usually assessment centers last 2 or 3 days because these things that you're asking people to do take time. Everything on this list takes some time, right? And so you probably can't cram it all into one day. So usually 2 to 3 days. Many large companies use these. Microsoft uses them. Amazon uses them for their corporate people. They're very expensive. They take a lot of time. I mean, 2 to 3 days of not doing your actual job so that you can participate in the assessment center. 2 to 3 days of applicants coming to our site, and we have to provide them with lunch or other kinds of things. I mean, that it's time consuming and it consumes like financial resources. You have to pay the people who are running the assessment centers. So it's expensive. So we would like to see a little bit better outcome, wouldn't we? Than 14 to 20% of variance. We've got this range because depending on what you include, depending on what job you're trying to model with this assessment center, they might be better or worse. They're fun and it feels like you're doing something really cool. So I think a lot of these larger organizations like to use them because they feel like they're maybe getting to know the applicants over that 2 to 3 day period, or they are really getting to see their incumbents in a different scenario, and maybe we'll see them through a different lens or something. But honestly, the data is not there to really support the use of assessment centers over some of the other things we've been talking about. But I think the thing it has in its favor is that like fun quality. It's like we're having a meeting versus we're going to a retreat, right? It's the same exact stuff that's going to happen, but the retreat is not in our normal meeting room. So now it's like different. I think it's the same thing. And so assessment centers are very attractive to large organizations. Now, something we've talked about already is biographical information. I was calling it biodata earlier. The premise behind biographical information, the reason why we collect that on like application forms and why it's all on our Vitas and stuff like that is because we assume that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. And that really strong evidence for that being true, that the way that you have behaved in the past is very likely how you will behave again in the future. So if we take that mindset, biographical data makes a lot of sense. So most every job in the entire world that you can think of has some kind of application blank. It's going to ask your historical information, like your birth date. It might ask, where your previous address was to get some information about like how often people move, stuff like that. Asks you your current information. It asks you historical information like when did you graduate high school? When did you graduate college? These kinds of things that might be in the past. a biodata questionnaire is a little bit more elaborate than an application blank. Application blanks oftentimes are very generic. You can go buy them at the local stationery store or download them off the internet, and you just have the standard application blank that a person can fill in. A biodata questionnaire is usually tailored to this particular job spec in the company, or like I'm thinking about at school, we have different categories of employees, and their biodata questionnaires, they're completed on the internet, but their questionnaires include different items because they've tailored it to professors versus classified staff versus, like the tradespeople on campus, things like that. And so you have different kinds of items depending on what kind of job you're hiring for. And so there might be multiple choice items. There might be broad questions that, a person's supposed to give a very general answer to. You might ask a bunch of different questions within an area. You can tailor it. And so that the hiring committee decides what they need to know in order to make a good decision. And that's what goes onto the biodata questionnaire. Biodata questionnaires account for about 10 to 27% of the variance. The more tailored the questionnaire, the better that predictability is going to be. If you use a standard one, you're basically using an application blank. It's just on the computer instead. So it's much better to do a biodata questionnaire that was tailored to the job. All right, almost every job includes some degree of an interview. It's among the most popular of all the selection devices. Almost every job, you have to sit for some kind of interview, at least talk to the manager, at least talk to somebody. A lot of organizations make the mistake of using unstructured interviews where they just sort of ask whatever questions seem appropriate to this particular person who's in front of me. No consistency of questioning across the applicants. The problem is, it's hard to make any comparisons between the applicants when everybody's been asked something different. Whatever came off the top of your head is what you asked. And so now when you sit down and you think, who answered my questions well, they answered different questions. So how am I supposed to make any kind of comparison between my applicants? So you won't be surprised to hear that we're going to recommend structured interviews, which is where you have standardized questions. Those questions are based on job analysis so that you can ask questions that are relevant to the job that the person's going to be doing. It's specific. This is going to give us increased reliability between participants, and it will allow us to make fair comparisons. Because everybody's been answering the same thing, we can do a direct comparison between how this person answered that question and how that person answered the question. Now, there's a thing called a behavior description interview, which is where the interviewees describe ways in which they have addressed past situations. We oftentimes, when hiring a faculty member, will ask questions like, you have a disruptive student in the classroom. Tell us how you have handled that in the past. And that would be a behavior description. So I've done this and I've done that. These are the ways that I've handled it in the past. A situational interview is where you say, what would you do if this happened? So we have one that we ask for our satellite campus faculty who don't have direct access to their colleagues or their chair because they're on a satellite campus. And they may have something that comes up and they can't immediately confer with somebody else. And so we ask that question, what would you do if something came up and you can't immediately reach your chair or maybe a more advanced colleague who's farther along? What would you do? How would you handle that situation? And so how they would handle it is part of that gives us some insight into how well they can think on their feet. It gives us information about what given that they are working in a sort of isolated situation, how are they going to handle that? Is it going to be too stressful for them to really not have access to somebody who could give them advice and stuff like that? So if you can set up your structured interview to make sure every single person gets either, how have you handled it in the past? How would you handle this thing that we know is really unique to our job situation? Then you can sit down and make a good side-by-side comparison. Unstructured interviews account for about 11% of the variance in job performance between applicants. Structured interviews account for about 44%. So there is some value to interviews, right? I mean, of all the things we've talked about so far, this is the one that accounts for a structured interview that includes questions that were generated based on job analysis, accounts for about 44% of the variance between people. So structured interviews are good. when we say that these are approved questions, there are certain things that we should not ask. So one of the things we do with our structured interview questions is we pass them past HR to make sure that we're not asking anything we shouldn't ask. Here are some things that you should not ask. How old are you? You're opening yourself up for an ageism claim. Have you ever been arrested? None of your business. Being arrested does not mean that I've ever been convicted of a crime. Do you plan on having children? Are you pregnant? Do not ask. Are you a U.S. citizen? Can't ask that. Do you have a disability? Do you have children? What is your daycare situation? Are you actively involved in the NAACP or any other group? You can't ask about their affiliation. You can ask, if you're interviewing a psychologist, do you belong to the Western Psychological Association? Okay, you're allowed to ask that. You're not allowed to ask, do you belong to any kind of, any kind of group that might indicate political affiliation or racial affiliation or anything. You can't ask that. You can't ask if you've ever been treated by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You can't ask if a person's ever been hospitalized, and absolutely cannot ask for what. These are getting crazier, aren't they? I mean, who asks these questions? How many days were you absent from work due to illness in the past year? Cannot ask. That's getting at disability questions, and you can't ask that. Are you taking any prescribed drugs? Can't ask that. So there is nice spectrum of stuff you have to stay away with. Basically, anything that could be construed as discriminatory or biased, you cannot ask those kinds of questions. And you certainly should not, if you're trying to boost the validity of your interview, ever ask one candidate something that you don't ask everybody. So a lot of times these questions are not relevant to all of your applicants. So that's a really good sign that, not even for the biased reason, but just because it's not going to be helpful in predicting their job performance. So just leave it out, because you can't make person-to-person comparisons if you leave it in. So that's a good rule of thumb anyway. All right, let's come back in our next video and we'll talk about estimating the validity coefficients.